We begin our journey not in the lavish halls of a finished palace, but in a world still defined by the echoes of a medieval past. As the gentle hum of our narrative begins, imagine yourself drifting back through the centuries, a quiet observer of a pivotal moment in European history. We are traveling to 17th century France, a kingdom on the cusp of an extraordinary transformation. At the heart of this change is a single, powerful figure, Louis XIV, a monarch whose reign would become a legend, a man who would come to be known as the Sun King. The story of Louis XIV is the story of ambition, power, and the grand spectacle of a life lived in the public eye. Born in 1638, his arrival was seen as a miracle, a God-given child to parents who had waited 2 decades for an heir. This divine anointment would define his entire life, instilling in him a profound belief in his own destiny and the concept of a divinely ordained absolute monarchy. He ascended to the throne at the tender age of 4, a fragile boy inheriting a kingdom in turmoil. His childhood was not one of uninterrupted privilege. It was a time of civil unrest and political instability. The Fronde, a series of violent uprisings by the nobility and the Parliament of Paris, deeply scarred the young king. He was forced to flee the royal palace, a terrifying experience that would forever shape his worldview. It was in this crucible of chaos that his resolve hardened, forging a king who was determined to centralize all power and ensure that no one, no noble or commoner, could ever again threaten the authority of the crown. For the first part of his reign, France was guided by his mother, Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, the cunning Cardinal Mazarin. It was Mazarin who tutored the young king, not just in Latin and hunting, but in the intricate dance of statecraft. Mazarin's influence was instrumental, preparing Louis for the immense responsibilities he would one day shoulder. However, when Mazarin died in 1661, the 22-year-old Louis made a stunning announcement. He declared that he would have no new chief minister. He would rule alone. This was a bold and unprecedented move, a clear signal that a new era had dawned in France. The age of the absolute monarch had truly begun, with Louis XIV as its living embodiment. The emblem he chose for himself was the sun. Just as the sun is the center of the solar system, providing light and life to all, Louis believed he was the center of France, the source of all power, order, and glory. From this moment on, he was the Sun King, a title that captured the essence of his self-image and his grand vision for the nation. This vision would manifest itself in the creation of a powerful, centralized state, a professional army, and, most famously, in the magnificent Palace of Versailles. Versailles was not merely a royal residence. It was a political tool, a gilded cage designed to draw the powerful nobility away from their provincial strongholds and into the constant, glittering orbit of the king. There, their lives were consumed by elaborate rituals and courtly etiquette, all centered on Louis himself, keeping them distracted and dependent on his favor. As we settle in for this long and detailed history, we will explore the many facets of this extraordinary reign. We will witness the opulence of Versailles and the intricate daily routines of the court. We will follow the course of his ambitious and costly wars, which expanded France's borders but also left the nation on the brink of financial ruin. We will examine the cultural revolution he ignited, fostering an age of flourishing arts, music, and literature that became the envy of Europe. We will see how his personal life, with its triumphs and tragedies, was inextricably linked to the fate of his kingdom. We will delve into the complexities of his legacy, understanding how his pursuit of power, order, and glory shaped not only France, but the very concept of monarchy itself. His reign of 72 years remains the longest in European history, a testament to his endurance, his strategic mind, and his unwavering belief in his own destiny. We now turn the page on this epic chapter, ready to be immersed in the world of Louis XIV and the Sun King's empire, a world where the light of the sun shone brightest from the center of France. As the details of his world begin to unfold, we invite you to find a calm and restful place and allow the quiet narrative of history to guide you into a state of deep reflection. We left our narrative at a moment of great anticipation, with a young king poised to take the reins of a kingdom. But to truly understand the man who would become the Sun King, we must first return to the world of his childhood, to the very events that forged his steel will and his profound distrust of the world around him. We drift back to the mid-17th century, to a time of both grandeur and chaos, to the France that Louis XIV first knew. Imagine the atmosphere of Paris in the 1640s. It is a city of sharp contrasts. The glittering court of the Palais Royal, filled with courtiers in silk and velvet, exists alongside bustling, often squalid streets filled with the clamor of merchants and artisans. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, baking bread, and the perfume of the nobility. Yet beneath this surface of activity, a sense of tension is building. The kingdom is weary from years of war with the Habsburgs and heavy taxation imposed to fund it. The common people are restless, and so too are the great nobles, who long to reclaim the power they feel has been unjustly taken from them by the centralizing efforts of previous monarchs. In the center of this volatile world is the boy king, Louis XIV, still known as Louis Dieudonné, or God-given. His father, Louis XIII, had died when he was just 4 years old, leaving the kingdom in the hands of a regency council. The power, however, truly resided with his mother, the Queen Regent Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, the Italian-born Cardinal Mazarin. It is impossible to overstate Mazarin's influence during these years. A brilliant diplomat and a cunning politician, he was a father figure, a teacher, and a strategist all in one. He guided Anne of Austria with a steady hand, and he educated the young king not with excessive pampering, but with a firm understanding of the duties and burdens of kingship. Yet, his foreign birth and his consolidation of power made him deeply unpopular with the old French aristocracy, who saw him as an upstart. This simmering discontent finally boiled over in a series of civil wars known as the Fronde. The name itself, Fronde, comes from the French word for a slingshot, a reference to the stone-throwing children of Paris who defied the authorities. This name perfectly captures the mixture of popular revolt and aristocratic maneuvering that characterized the conflict. The Fronde was not a single, unified rebellion, but rather two distinct waves. The first, beginning in 1648, was the Parliamentary Fronde. The Parliament of Paris, a high court of magistrates and lawyers, refused to register a new series of royal decrees that would raise taxes. They demanded an end to arbitrary arrests and the creation of a more representative government. This was a direct challenge to the authority of the crown, and the situation quickly escalated. For the boy king and his family, life suddenly became a waking nightmare. One morning in January 1649, a popular uprising forced the royal family to secretly flee Paris. Imagine the scene. The royal carriage, in the dead of night, slipping away from the city gates under a veil of secrecy, its occupants leaving behind the warmth of their palace for the cold, unwelcoming Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. For the next several months, the young Louis lived in a state of semi-exile, enduring cold rooms and a lack of the usual comforts. He would remember this humiliation for the rest of his life. He saw firsthand that the loyalty of the nobles could not be trusted and that the common people of Paris could turn against their monarch. It was a formative trauma that instilled in him an unshakable resolve to never again be at the mercy of others. After a temporary peace was brokered, a second, more dangerous phase of the conflict began, the Fronde of the Princes. This was a rebellion led by powerful nobles, most notably the Prince de Condé, a brilliant military commander who had previously fought for the crown. The princes were not fighting for the rights of the people. They were fighting for their own power and influence, seeking to reduce the authority of the king and his chief minister. This was a civil war of families and factions, a complicated and brutal struggle that tore the fabric of French society. Throughout these tumultuous years, the young Louis was a witness to all of it. He saw the inconstancy of the nobles, the brutality of civil conflict, and the precariousness of royal power when not firmly held. He observed Mazarin's masterful maneuvering, his strategic exiles and returns, his ability to play one faction against another until all were exhausted. By 1653, the last of the rebels had been defeated, and the Fronde was officially over. Mazarin had won, but the scars of the conflict ran deep, especially in the young king's mind. With the end of the rebellion, Mazarin's authority was absolute, and he set about rebuilding the kingdom's finances and military strength. He continued to mentor Louis, teaching him the intricacies of diplomacy and war, the importance of a strong, standing army, and the absolute necessity of centralizing power. He was preparing the ground for the young king's personal rule, molding him into the very ideal of a sovereign. The years following the Fronde were a time of relative peace and growing stability, as Mazarin's influence reached its zenith. Then, in March of 1661, Cardinal Mazarin, the man who had guided France for nearly 2 decades, finally passed away. The 22-year-old Louis XIV, now a man of ambition and hardened resolve, summoned his council. The courtiers and ministers expected him to appoint a new chief minister, a replacement for the great cardinal. But Louis surprised them all with a simple, stark declaration: "The affairs of the state will be run by me." From this moment, the kingdom would have no prime minister. The young king, forged in the crucible of civil war and tutored by a master of statecraft, would take his place at the head of the government. This was a powerful, symbolic act, a promise to himself and to France that he would never again allow his power to be threatened by nobles or ministers. He would rule alone. As we bring this chapter to a close, let the images of the young king, forced to flee his home, and the sounds of a nation in turmoil gently fade. This period of instability was not a weakness but a foundation. It taught Louis the most crucial lesson of his life, that true power resides not in inherited status, but in absolute control. The boy king has now become the man who will command an empire. Rest now, as the next chapter of his grand design begins to unfold. As the echoes of the Fronde faded into memory, a new era began to dawn for France. Louis XIV, having declared his intention to rule alone, now faced the monumental task of transforming that declaration into a living reality. This was not a swift change, but a deliberate and meticulous process of consolidating power and projecting an image of unrivaled authority. The air in Paris was different now. It was charged with a new energy, a palpable sense of purpose emanating from the young king. Imagine the king's council meetings after 1661. Gone were the days of a powerful chief minister dominating the conversation. Instead, Louis sat at the head of the table, listening intently, asking questions, and always making the final decision. He was a man of immense physical and mental stamina, capable of working for hours on end, poring over documents and meeting with his ministers. He had a keen eye for talent, and he surrounded himself with a new class of ministers, men of humble birth like Jean-Baptiste Colbert, not great nobles. These men owed their positions entirely to him, and their loyalty was absolute. This was a masterstroke of political strategy, ensuring that his power would not be challenged from within his own government. Colbert, in particular, became the architect of France's economic and financial policies. He was a tireless and brilliant administrator who sought to bring order to the nation's chaotic finances. He championed a policy known as mercantilism, which we can think of as a system designed to make a nation as wealthy and self-sufficient as possible. Colbert's vision was to fill the royal treasury by promoting French industries, imposing high tariffs on foreign goods, and expanding France's colonial empire to secure raw materials and new markets. He oversaw the creation of royal factories, encouraged trade, and built up a powerful merchant navy. These policies, while sometimes harsh on the common people through heavy taxation, laid the economic foundation for the grandeur of Louis's reign and funded his grand projects and wars. But Louis understood that power was not just about money and administration. It was also about symbolism, spectacle, and control. His most enduring and visible legacy would be the Palace of Versailles. The story of Versailles begins humbly, as a small, unassuming hunting lodge built by his father, Louis XIII. But for Louis XIV, this simple retreat held a much grander potential. He saw in it the perfect canvas for his absolute authority. His decision to transform this modest lodge into a sprawling golden palace was not one of mere vanity, but of calculated political genius. Picture the French countryside, just a dozen miles southwest of Paris. There, a small chateau begins to swell in size, an army of thousands of workers, stonemasons, painters, sculptors, and gardeners, toiling day and night. The noise is constant, the pace frantic. The goal is not just to build a palace, but to create an entire world, a microcosm of the Sun King's power. The landscape itself is bent to his will, swamps are drained, forests are tamed, and a vast, intricate network of canals and fountains is engineered to bring water to the ornate gardens. These gardens are a wonder in themselves. Designed by André Lenotre, They are a perfect example of the French formal garden style, a triumph of geometric order over untamed nature. From the Grand Canal, where the king and his courtiers would take gondola rides, to the meticulously trimmed hedges and sculpted topiaries, every element of the garden is an expression of royal control and absolute order. The sense of peace and harmony you feel while walking through these spaces today is no accident. It was a deliberate design to reflect the order and stability Louis believed he had brought to his kingdom. The palace itself is a breathtaking marvel. The centerpiece, of course, is the Hall of Mirrors, a long gallery with 17 arched windows on one side and 17 matching mirrored arches on the other. The ceiling is painted with allegorical scenes celebrating the king's military and political victories. As you walk through this hall, the light from the windows and the candles at night would be reflected endlessly, creating an illusion of infinite space and infinite light, with the king himself at the very heart of the dazzling spectacle. It was a space designed to inspire awe and a sense of the king's majesty. By 1682, Versailles was ready to become the permanent seat of the French court and government. Louis commanded the great nobles of France to leave their ancestral chateau and live at Versailles with him. This was perhaps his greatest political achievement. By requiring the aristocracy to live at court, he could keep a close eye on them, distracting them with lavish banquets, balls, and hunting parties. The nobles, who once had the power to raise armies and challenge the king, now found themselves competing for the honor of handing the king his shirt in the morning or being seen in his presence. Their power was not broken, but it was redirected. They were no longer a threat. They were part of his elaborate cosmic system, all orbiting the Sun King. Daily life at Versailles was a grand and public performance, a constant reenactment of the king's power. Louis's day began with the lever, the rising, and ended with the coucher, the going to bed, both of which were highly ritualized ceremonies attended by hundreds of courtiers. Every act, from the king's dressing to his meals, was a public event, a stage for the king to reinforce his authority and for the nobles to jockey for position and favor. The king's life was not his own. It belonged to the state and was a symbol of its power. As we conclude this chapter, let us reflect on the immense scale of this endeavor. Louis XIV did not just build a palace, he built a system of governance and a culture of obedience. He transformed a hunting lodge into the very heart of a new kind of state, where all power flowed from the king and all life revolved around him. The sun had risen, and its golden light now cast a long shadow over all of France, defining a new reality for the nobility, the ministers, and the king himself. This was the foundation of the Sun King's empire, and it was a world of breathtaking beauty and meticulous control. As your mind drifts, let the images of gilded halls, flowing fountains, and manicured gardens guide you to a peaceful rest. The dawn of the absolute monarchy has arrived, and its story has only just begun. The absolute control that Louis XIV established at home was merely the foundation for his ambitions abroad. He saw his reign not just as an opportunity to secure France's internal stability, but to establish its preeminence in Europe. As the gilded halls of Versailles buzzed with the daily rituals of court life, a more serious and strategic game was being played on the continent. The era of the Sun King's wars had begun, a period that would see France's borders expand and its influence reach new heights, but at an immense and often ruinous cost. Louis was a ruler who believed deeply in the concept of gloire, or glory. This was not simple vanity. It was a profound sense of national pride and a king's duty to enhance the power and reputation of his kingdom. To achieve this, he knew he needed a military machine unlike any Europe had ever seen. He placed the brilliant and ruthless Marquis de Louvois in charge of the army. Louvois revolutionized the French military, creating a standing army of professional soldiers who were well-trained, regularly paid, and disciplined. This was a radical change from the old system of feudal levies and mercenaries. He also standardized uniforms and created a more efficient system of logistics and supply. Under Louvois, the French army became the most formidable fighting force of its time. At the same time, the genius military engineer Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban was brought in to fortify France's borders. Vauban's genius lay not just in building impregnable fortresses, but in creating a sophisticated system of defensive and offensive fortifications that shaped the very landscape of France's frontiers. His designs, a series of complex star-shaped bastions and moats, became the gold standard of military architecture. He built or improved over 300 fortresses, creating a protective belt around the kingdom that was nearly impossible to penetrate. The sight of these massive stone structures, meticulously designed and strategically placed, stands as a quiet testament to the seriousness of Louis's military intent. Louis's first major conflict was the War of Devolution, 1667 to 1668. The name, devolution, comes from a local law in some of the Spanish Netherlands that favored children from a first marriage over those from a second. When the Spanish king died, Louis, through his wife Maria Theresa, claimed a right to these territories. It was a quick and successful war for France. Louis personally led his troops, a dazzling and confident young monarch at the head of a powerful army. The war was brief, but it signaled to the rest of Europe that France was a rising power and Louis a man to be reckoned with. Other European nations, particularly the Dutch, became wary of French expansionism. This growing rivalry with the Dutch Republic led to the Franco-Dutch War, 1672 to 1678. Louis saw the Dutch as both a commercial rival and a political nuisance, as they were a Protestant republic and a vocal critic of his Catholic, absolutist rule. He invaded the Netherlands with a massive army, quickly overrunning large parts of the country. The Dutch, in a desperate act, opened their dikes and flooded the countryside, slowing the French advance and saving their major cities. This war was a far more costly and prolonged affair than the previous one, forcing other European powers, including Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, to join a coalition against France. Despite the fierce opposition, Louis ultimately emerged with significant territorial gains, including the province of Franche-Comté. He was at the zenith of his power, a triumphant victor who had humbled Europe's other great powers. Between these wars, and even during them, the cultural life of France continued to flourish under the king's patronage. This was a period known as the Grand Siècle, or the Great Century. Versailles was not just a political capital, but a cultural one. The king sponsored writers like Molière, whose comedies satirized the foibles of the French court and society, and Jean Racine, whose tragedies explored the depths of human emotion. Artists like Charles Le Brun filled the palace with stunning paintings and tapestries, while composers such as Jean-Baptiste Lully wrote music that defined the courtly style and filled the air of the vast halls with elegant melodies. It was a time when French art, literature, and thought became the benchmark for all of Europe. The image of the Sun King was not only projected by his armies, but by his poets, his painters, and his musicians, creating a powerful cultural force that spread throughout the continent. But as the 17th century drew to a close, Louis's ambition began to face greater challenges. The growing fear of French dominance led to the formation of a massive anti-French coalition, culminating in the War of the Grand Alliance, 1688 to 1697. This was a truly global conflict, fought not just in Europe but in North America and Asia, and it pitted France against virtually all of its neighbors, including England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Dutch Republic. For the first time, Louis found himself on the defensive, his military strength stretched to its limit. The war was a brutal stalemate, with no decisive victor, and it exacted a heavy toll on France. The immense cost of the army, the fortifications, and the campaigns began to drain the treasury that Colbert had so carefully filled. As we bring this chapter to a quiet close, we must reflect on this dual-sided coin of Louis's reign. On one side, we see the gleaming, glorious achievements, a professional army, impregnable borders, and a cultural golden age that established France as the model for all of Europe. On the other side, we see the immense human and financial cost. The constant state of war led to crushing taxes and a heavy burden on the French populace. The Sun King's thirst for glory, while dazzling, was also insatiable. His empire was expanding, but its foundations were beginning to show cracks. Let the images of disciplined soldiers, vast fortresses, and opulent courts blend into a single picture of a kingdom at the height of its power and the beginning of its great struggle. As you rest, know that the path of the Sun King, once a clear and victorious one, is now becoming far more complex. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the golden light of the Sun King's reign began to cast longer, more complex shadows. The military glories of his earlier years and the splendor of Versailles were now juxtaposed with a series of profound challenges: religious strife, a crushing national debt, and the immense human cost of endless warfare. The image of the triumphant conqueror was slowly and painstakingly being replaced by that of an aging monarch grappling with the consequences of his own policies. Perhaps the most significant and controversial act of Louis's later reign was the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. To understand this, we must first recall what the Edict of Nantes was. Issued by his grandfather, King Henry IV, in 1598, it had granted French Protestants, known as Huguenots, a degree of religious freedom and civil rights. It was a landmark piece of legislation that had brought a measure of peace to a nation torn apart by religious wars. For nearly a century, it had allowed Huguenots to worship and live openly in a predominantly Catholic kingdom. However, Louis XIV, as a devout Catholic and a firm believer in the ideal of one king, one law, one faith, viewed the existence of a separate religious group as a threat to the unity and stability of his state. His decision to revoke the Edict of Nantes was not sudden. For years, the government had implemented a series of persecutory measures known as dragonnades, in which soldiers, dragons, were quartered in Protestant homes, where they were given license to harass and intimidate the families until they converted to Catholicism. The revocation was the culmination of this policy, making Protestantism illegal in France. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Over 200,000 Huguenots, many of whom were skilled artisans, merchants, and soldiers, fled France. They took their expertise, their wealth, and their industrious spirit with them, settling in Protestant nations like England, the Dutch Republic, Prussia, and the American colonies. This mass exodus dealt a serious blow to the French economy and industry, which would feel the effects for generations. Furthermore, it damaged Louis XIV's international reputation, turning him from a figure of respect to a symbol of religious intolerance. Simultaneously, the wars of the previous decades had drained the royal treasury, which had once seemed so full. The vast sums required to maintain a massive standing army, to fortify borders, and to wage campaigns across Europe had resulted in a national debt of staggering proportions. Colbert's careful economic policies had given way to desperate measures. The common people bore the brunt of this financial crisis through heavy and relentless taxation. And as the 18th century began, poverty and hardship were widespread. The gilded halls of Versailles, though still shimmering, now stood in stark contrast to the quiet desperation of the French countryside and the slums of Paris. This immense financial and social strain was only compounded by Louis's final and most devastating war, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. The war's origins lay in a dynastic crisis. The King of Spain, Charles II, had died childless. Before his death, he had named Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, as his heir, on the condition that the French and Spanish crowns would never be united. Louis, a man who saw his family's destiny intertwined with the destiny of nations, accepted the Spanish throne for his grandson. This move, however, was seen by the rest of Europe as a dangerous play for French hegemony. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and other powers formed a coalition to prevent the expansion of French power, sparking a brutal 13-year conflict. This war was a different kind of struggle for Louis XIV. It was not a series of swift, triumphant campaigns. Instead, it was a grinding, costly, and often heartbreaking affair. The Duke of Marlborough, a brilliant English general, inflicted a series of crushing defeats on the French army at battles like Blenheim and Malplaquet. These were not glorious victories for anyone. They were battles of attrition, fought on a scale previously unimaginable, with tens of thousands of casualties. The news of these defeats was a heavy burden on the aging king. He was no longer the young conqueror leading his troops from the front. He was an old man, receiving news of his nation's struggles from his study at Versailles. To make matters worse, Louis XIV endured a series of profound personal tragedies in the final years of his life. In the span of just a few years, a terrible outbreak of smallpox or measles ravaged his family. His son and heir, the Grand Dauphin, died in 1711. The very next year, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, a man who had been carefully groomed to rule, died along with his wife and eldest son. Suddenly, the royal line had been decimated. The heir to the throne was a frail 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XIV. The Sun King, who had so carefully planned for the future of his dynasty, now saw it hanging by a thread. As we conclude this chapter, let us contemplate the image of the aging monarch. He is no longer at the zenith of his power, but a figure surrounded by ghosts, mourning the loss of his family, and facing a kingdom that is exhausted and impoverished. The glorious sun that once shone so brightly now seems to be setting, casting long, dark shadows over the land. The man who had once embodied the very idea of absolute power was now, in his final years, a figure of immense sorrow and quiet fortitude. A king whose reign of glory was now being defined by a period of immense struggle and profound loss. May these somber yet powerful images guide you into a quiet and peaceful rest. As the long, exhausting war of the Spanish succession finally drew to a close, the atmosphere at Versailles shifted from one of grim determination to a weary but palpable sense of relief. The treaties of Utrecht in 1713 and Rastatt in 1714 formally ended the conflict, bringing a conclusion to decades of almost continuous warfare. Louis XIV's great ambition to see his grandson on the Spanish throne was realized, a final, poignant victory that came at an extraordinary cost. But the terms of the peace were a delicate compromise. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain, but the crowns of Spain and France were to remain forever separate. A clause that was a bitter pill for Louis to swallow, yet a necessary concession to Europe's fear of a united Bourbon Empire. The king who presided over this hard-won peace was a far different man from the dazzling young monarch of the 1660s. Louis XIV was now in his 70s, a figure of immense dignity and gravitas, but also of great physical frailty. His once vigorous constitution was now riddled with a series of debilitating ailments. Yet, even in his old age, he remained a tireless worker. He continued to hold court, to attend to the details of governance, and to perform his daily rituals with the same meticulous precision he had always demanded. The great public spectacle of his life continued, but it was now performed by a man who moved with a slower, more deliberate pace. In these final years, the quiet, calming influence of his second and deeply pious wife, Françoise d'Aubigné, known as Madame de Maintenon, became a central part of his life. She was a woman of intelligence, grace, and devout faith, and their morganatic marriage, a marriage between people of unequal social rank that prevents the lower-ranking person from inheriting titles or privileges, offered the king a source of private comfort and emotional stability that was absent from his public life. Under her influence, the court became more somber and devout. The lavish balls and theatrical performances of his earlier reign were replaced with quiet reflection and religious observance. The Sun King, once a symbol of worldly glory, was now turning his attention to matters of the soul and the divine grace he had always claimed as his birthright. The atmosphere at Versailles was a fascinating study in contrast. On one hand, life went on with its usual ceremonial rhythm. The magnificent gardens were still meticulously tended, the fountains still played, and the nobility still orbited the king in their daily dance of status and favor. But beneath this surface of routine, a new kind of tension was brewing. With the king's health failing and the heir to the throne being a young boy, the court became a hotbed of intrigue. Nobles and factions, who had been kept in check by Louis's absolute authority, now began to quietly maneuver for power, positioning themselves for the regency that was sure to follow his death. The focus of the court's gaze was no longer just on the king, but on the future, on the new era that was drawing near. The king's final illness began in August of 1715. It was a debilitating infection in his leg, likely gangrene, which resisted all medical treatments of the time. Imagine the quiet, hushed atmosphere in the king's private apartments. The vast halls of Versailles, usually filled with the sounds of courtly life, were now muted. Courtiers spoke in whispers, and physicians moved with a solemn purpose. Throughout his final days, Louis XIV showed the same stoicism that had defined his entire reign. He was a king who had always viewed his life as a public performance, and his death would be no different. On his deathbed, he offered words of wisdom to his 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV. "You are going to be a great king," he is said to have told the boy. "Do not imitate me in my love of building or my love of war. Instead, be a peaceful king and work to relieve the misery of your people." These are the words of an old man who, at the very end of his life, understood the immense burdens his ambition had placed upon his nation. It was a final, humble confession from a king who had spent his life convinced of his own divine infallibility. On September 1st, 1715, after a reign of 72 years, Louis XIV died, just a few days short of his 77th birthday. The Sun King, who had been the central figure of Europe for so long, was gone. The immediate reaction of the French people was complex. A weary populace, exhausted by war and heavy taxes, initially greeted the news with a sense of relief. It was the end of a long and difficult era, but this was soon replaced by a more profound sense of loss. A king who had defined their world for so long had passed, and the future was now uncertain. The great and long-lived sun had set. As we bring this chapter to a peaceful close, let us sit with the final quiet images of the Sun King's twilight. The stoic old man on his deathbed, the hushed corridors of Versailles, the final solemn words of a king who, in his last moments, sought to learn from the very mistakes that had brought him so much glory and so much sorrow. His life, a long journey from a boy in the midst of civil war to an old man at the end of a great empire, has now reached its end. Rest now as we prepare to reflect on the lasting legacy of his long and extraordinary reign. The long life of Louis XIV had finally drawn to a close, but the story of the Sun King's empire did not end with his passing. Instead, his legacy, a complex tapestry of triumph and tragedy, would continue to shape France and Europe for centuries to come. His reign was so long, so impactful, that it did not simply end. It became the new beginning for the world that followed. The quiet moments after his death were just the first breath of a new age that would forever bear his mark. The most profound of his legacies was, without a doubt, the creation of the modern, centralized French state. Louis XIV took a kingdom of scattered feudal power and forged it into a cohesive nation ruled from a single, powerful center. His theory of absolute monarchy, where the king's authority was divinely ordained and unquestioned, became the blueprint for rulers across the continent. He systematically brought the powerful nobility to heel, turning them from potential rivals into courtiers who depended on his favor. Versailles was his greatest tool in this endeavor, not just a palace, but a political engine that neutralized the old aristocratic order. This centralization of power, while effective in the short term, also sowed the seeds of future conflict. It created a system where all authority rested on one person, a system that would be increasingly challenged by new ideas of liberty and reason that were emerging from the Enlightenment. Economically, his legacy was just as double-edged. Under the careful stewardship of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the early years of Louis's personal rule saw a remarkable period of growth and prosperity. Mercantilism, the policy of state-controlled trade and industry, filled the royal treasury and built up a powerful French economy. France became a global player with a growing colonial empire and a formidable navy. However, this economic strength was ultimately overwhelmed by the relentless cost of his wars. By the end of his reign, the kingdom was burdened with an immense national debt that crippled its finances. This fiscal instability, a direct result of his pursuit of gloire, would become a major factor in the political unrest of the 18th century, ultimately leading to the French Revolution decades later. The Sun King's glory, it turned out, was an incredibly expensive pursuit. Culturally, however, the legacy of Louis XIV is almost universally celebrated. His reign, the Grand Siècle, set a standard of artistic excellence that transformed France into the cultural heart of Europe. The French language, refined and promoted by the French Academy, became the language of diplomacy and the international elite. French fashion, art, and architecture were emulated everywhere. The magnificent Palace of Versailles became the model for royal residences across Europe, inspiring palaces from Schönbrunn in Austria to Potsdam in Prussia. The artistic talents he fostered, the dramatic works of Molière and Racine, the musical compositions of Lully, the grand paintings of Lebrun, became the benchmark for all of Europe. The king understood that cultural power was just as important as military power, and his patronage created a legacy that transcended borders and time. Yet this magnificent cultural flowering was intertwined with a darker legacy of intolerance. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes, his policy of religious persecution against the Huguenots, was an act that forever stained his reputation. It was a grave mistake that weakened France economically and turned much of Protestant Europe against him. This act, driven by a desire for complete religious unity, stands as a stark reminder that even in a reign of great brilliance, the human cost of a monarch's convictions could be devastating. The Sun King's reign, therefore, is not a simple story of triumph or failure. It is a chronicle of a man who, driven by a profound sense of destiny, bent an entire nation to his will. He believed that he was the living embodiment of the state, and in many ways, he was right. He built a system of governance that endured for more than a century and created a cultural powerhouse that still influences the world today. He was a king who could be ruthless and brilliant, pious and extravagant. He could inspire unwavering loyalty and fierce opposition. As we bring our long journey through the Sun King's empire to its final conclusion, let the many facets of his life settle quietly in your mind. The image of the young boy hiding from rebels, the mature king dancing at Versailles, the victorious general on the battlefield, and the frail old man offering his final advice. His world was one of magnificent palaces and brutal wars, of cultural genius and political calculation, of personal tragedies and unparalleled public spectacle. Louis XIV's long and extraordinary reign did not just define an era, it created a world. And in the quiet of this moment, as you drift into a state of deep and peaceful rest, may the grand story of the Sun King serve as a gentle backdrop for your quiet thoughts and a reminder of how one man's vision can change the course of history.